Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Normally Maria kicks off these grad school preparation talks, but she was double booked with sporting events for multiple kids in multiple locations, so I'm going to be flying solo on this one. Um, Thanks for being here. I am here to talk to you about letters of recommendation as you are in the what I would assume is either a year before or starting now to do your grad school applications. So just the very basics of the letters of recommendation. Almost every school requires three. Um, and SIDCAS, the centralized application service that I'm sure you're familiar with, will allow you to upload as many as five. So I think the first question that a lot of people ask is if you can upload five, should you be uploading five? Um, Let me start by saying no. I think three is plenty. If you want to do more than three, no one's going to penalize you for it, but you're not going to get penalized if you only have three compared to someone else who has four or five. The important thing is that the letters are saying good things about you, and it does not matter what the number of them is as long as you hit the minimum number of three. Other things to note is in the mechanics, the machinery of SIDCAS, um, you can complete your application and have your application verified in the SIDCAS system. And all that can be done before your three letters of recommendation have been uploaded. So as long as you've put in the identifying information for the person who's going to be writing for you, for example, if you asked me to write a letter for you, you'd give them my name, my contact information. SIDCAS would generate a request to me to upload a letter and a recommendation, and your application can be completed and verified before that's done. And so, in terms of the timing, you can, as long as the letter is uploaded before the application deadline at the institution that you're applying to. So most places, Ohio State included, set their deadline as December 25th or December 15th, excuse me. As long as that letter is in by December 15th, you have nothing to worry about. And so that is just sort of the machinery. I think the other questions that typically come up, and I will certainly leave plenty of time for you guys to ask any questions that you have, um, is the first one is, who should you be asking? And um, it varies a little bit, I think, from individual reviewer to individual reviewer, but it is important, I think, to at least have two of the three that are references from academic instructors who you've had in class. Um, it's a little bit there's unless you have worked very closely with a clinician, a speech language pathologist, or an audiologist, depending on what program you're applying to, unless you've worked very closely with them, in a clinical capacity, such as an audiology or speech language pathology assistant, something like that. If you've just shadowed at a clinic, oftentimes those letters don't get into a lot of depth about how you're going to be successful in grad school. So I think at least two academic references. Doesn't have to be people from speech and hearing. If you have relationships or have worked closely with people in other departments who can speak to your academic potential, if you've done research or scholarship activities with someone in a different department, they can speak about having worked with you and the talent that you have. I think that stuff is equally valuable. So it doesn't have to be people from speech and hearing, it doesn't have to be people from your speech and hearing undergrad classes, but I think two academic letters. And then the third one, I think you can be a little bit looser with in terms of the criteria. But it's somebody who needs to be able to speak to how effective you're going to be both as a graduate student academically, but also as a graduate student who's going to be delivering clinical services. So if it is, a job that you have off campus, that person needs to be able to speak to why the skills that you've displayed as an employee in that job are going to translate to effectiveness in grad school. And that can be tricky because a lot of times those people haven't gone to grad school for speech language pathology or audiology. So there's a little bit of a leap that they may be making in terms of the letter that they write. Um, the other thing I would certainly shy away from is people with whom you have a personal relationship. Um, if they are writing for you because they are a relative, something like that, rather than because they've seen you in a professional context or an academic context. That makes the letter just a little bit like it's a little punchless. It's just hard to take that seriously and to extract a lot of meaning from it when the people know that they're not make that that person is not making an unbiased professional judgment of you. And that's ultimately, I think, the thing that matters the most is can I have confidence that if you had weaknesses, this person would be telling me that you did. If they saw concerns or red flags about you as a potential graduate student or as a clinician, that they would be able to recognize those and that they would speak honestly about them. That's what I think we're looking for in the letters that we read. And so I think that's something certainly that you want to emphasize in the people who you ask to be letter writers for you. Um, does not mean you need to have a close relationship with them. I've certainly written letters for people who have been in my classes, but who I don't have a long-term working relationship with. Um, but that's the next thing I wanted to talk about is what would you ideally like to see in those letters? You know, you obviously don't get to dictate what the content is, but what are you know, if you're thinking about who am I going to ask, then the question becomes, well, what do I want them to say? Certainly, again, you want to speak to your academic potential. Um, you know, the couple of times where I've been hesitant to write for someone is if they took my class as an undergrad and they didn't do very well. They didn't get a particularly high grade. It becomes difficult for me in that case to say that I have a lot of confidence in them as future grad students. And so in that instance, it's up to me as the person being asked about what do I want to say to that person who's asking. Um, you know, do I want to just say, sure, I'll write for you and then express a lot of concerns? Or do I want to tell that person, hey, I can write for you, but I can't speak a lot of positive, you know, I can't say a lot of positive things about your academic potential because I just didn't see evidence of it when you were a student in my course. And that's usually the option that I take. Again, it's been very rare that I've done that, but I'm not going to just set somebody up to fail. I'm not going to say, yes, I'll write for you and then say a bunch of negative things about them. Instead, I would tell them, look, you know, I can say positive things that I see and that I think you have potential for, but I can't speak positively to your academic reputation based on the class that you took from me. And then it's up to the student to decide whether that's something that they want to do. But then the next thing is like, what else do you want them to say? And that's really something for you. You know, the letter writer will engage with you and they will ask you, you know, if sometimes they'll want to meet with you. I always want to meet with the people who I'm writing letters for. Sometimes they will want to see your CV or your personal statement to get a sense for, you know, what are the other highlights in your academic career that they will want to emphasize. Um, because it's really not that useful for me to say student X took my class, student X got an A in my class, and you know they were attentive in class. Like that stuff is pretty limited in the insight that it provides because you know you can look up what the if you took you know speech and hearing 5 760 from me, they can see in your transcript what letter grade you got. Me just restating that this person got a good grade in my class, the person who's reviewing already knows that. And so the question becomes, well, what insight can you actually provide and what do you want that person to be telling about you? And so the first thing I ask students every time is, you know, what is the part of your story that you want me to highlight and you want me to emphasize? And, you know, sometimes it's easier to have somebody else brag about your accomplishments than it is for you to brag about your own when you're writing your personal statement. If you're anything like me, you know, I don't like spending a lot of time talking about the things that I do well. I tend, when I'm writing about myself, I'm writing a bio or something for a presentation that I'm going to give, I tend to kind of water down my accomplishments because it just that stuff makes me uncomfortable. And so, but it's a lot easier for me to talk and brag about the excellent things that you guys have done as students, than it is sometimes for you to talk about them yourself. And so in that case, it's just what is your story? What makes you a candidate for grad school? And what are the things that are not going to be captured in your GPA, that are not going to be captured in your extracurricular activities that will all be listed out in your SIDCAS application? What are the other things that you would want me to potentially highlight? And sometimes the person doesn't really have anything else like that, you know, their accomplishments are all spelled out and I can still say, hey, this person's great. I think they're going to do great at the next level because of all the accomplishments that they have, both academically and extracurricularly. And sometimes other people have really interesting stories to tell that are really hard to capture um, in even a personal statement, but just things like people who worked all the way through undergrad. I mean, that is hard. I didn't do that when I was an undergrad student. And there's a lot of that speaks to people's resiliency. It speaks to their ability to time manage, and it suggests that they won't necessarily be as easily overwhelmed by grad school as maybe somebody else. Doesn't mean if you're not working right now that you're at a disadvantage. It's all really about just spelling out the positive things in everyone's application, and everybody has positive things, and which is why almost all of our students get into grad schools that they want to go to. So you're all coming at this with strong credentials, and it's just about finding people who can help accentuate those credentials as much as possible. So I would just my advice to you is to just be prepared to answer the question of what do you want me to emphasize? What do you want me to talk about? What is your story that we want to be talking, we want to be bragging about on your behalf in your letters of recommendation. The other thing I would emphasize is, I will speak for the faculty. I'm the chair of the department. I'll speak for the faculty when I say that we all want you to be successful. No one is going to set you up to fail. No one is trying to, to quote unquote phone in these letters and just get them over with. People want to say things that are going to help you reach the next level because you all deserve to be there, and we want to put you in the best possible position to succeed. So the last thing, I know I'm going fast through these things, but the last thing I think that people often ask is about sort of how do you approach somebody to ask them for a letter? Um, and for me, the easiest thing is to just flat out ask in an email, hey, I was a student of yours in such and such a class. I mean, the reality is the classes that we have typically have 50 to 75 students in them. Most of us teach those classes two semesters a year. So there's a lot of people, and it's not necessarily, the name recognition isn't necessarily going to be there. Um, doesn't mean we don't care. Doesn't mean we don't want to do it. But just sort of introduce yourself, talk about how you have a relationship to that instructor, and then just ask them if that's something that they would be open to doing. I tend when I'm asking people to do anything, I often put a little bit of a disclaimer at the end and say, look, I understand that you're busy. I know you have a lot of other time priorities. So if this isn't something you can do, I certainly understand. But that's just that's a variation in writing style. The only thing you don't want to communicate is some sense of, hey, you know, this is something I need you to do, so go do it for me. I don't think anyone's going to do that, but I just want to make sure that that's the message that I'm sending is you just want to approach it with some humility. This is not something that anyone is obligated to do. So you just want to ask instead of expect, the answer to be yes. But I think you can expect most of the time that the answer will be yes. Um, the other thing I'll add is, if any of you do find yourself in a spot where, other people are not available, the people that you had expected would say, yes, we're not available to help you out. There are certainly plenty of different circumstances in which that might happen. You can always reach out to me, and I'll be happy to support if you need to get to a third letter. I'll be happy to meet with you and write that letter for you. And so, use me as a resource if you need to. But most of the time, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. But again, on behalf of my faculty, I teach a late class. A lot of people don't take me until spring of the year they're graduating, which means that their applications are already done. So the number of requests that I get in a given year is typically pretty low. We have people who are getting asked to do 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 of them in a given term. And it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of people to meet with. It's a lot of letters to write. And so I would just ask for some grace on behalf of the faculty if anyone does say, hey, I have to cap, I have to have a certain limit because I just don't have the time to write good letters for 80 people in a given year. So, please be patient with that and be understanding. But if that does happen to you, just reach out to me and I'll make sure to either connect you with somebody who does have availability or I will fill in for them myself. So I talked for 15 straight minutes just now. Let me ask you if you have questions for me. And feel free to either unmute yourself and ask them or type them in a chat. Either way, I'm good to go.
I have a question about like the SLP versus faculty or like faculty that you've done research with.
Yep.
I feel like a lot of schools are very heavy on wanting your letters of recommendation to be from a speech language pathologist, but the people that I have in mind to write my letters of rec, none of them are like clinicians in speech language pathology, but are like professors in speech and hearing or a professor I've done research with or something like that.
So when you say that, can I ask you who are you hearing from at those other schools are saying to make sure that you're getting letters from like certified speech language pathologists?
Yeah, I've sat in on a similar like info session for Cleveland State, and they were like really heavy on wanting those letters of rec to be from speech language pathologists, which I could get, but I feel like my letters of recommendation would be written well from the other choices that I have.
Yeah, so the reason I'm asking the follow-up question was I've just never heard that messaging before. And what I can say is, I mean, the most of our students are getting letters from the types of people that you're talking about. Instructors, course instructors, people with whom they've not done like clinical activities. And we are not having any history of problems getting students admitted to those programs. So I think your initial instinct is the correct one. If you think people can write good letters for you, the fact that they are not practicing clinicians, I do not expect that to be a problem for you with any program.
All
Um,
right, thank you so
so
much.
I wouldn't hesitate to do that. Other questions that you folks might have? I'm trying to think if there's anything that I missed. I always have sort of a mental agenda that I want to work through, and I don't want to make sure I didn't run over anything and forget to talk about anything. So let me just think for a second. If again, please unmute yourself or chat anything in that you think of that we haven't touched on. Um, the other thing I think that does come up is questions about the timing. When is it appropriate to ask? If you are applying this year, um, sooner rather than later, I wouldn't hesitate. Um, I think now is the time when a lot of those requests, the beginning of the semester is when a lot of those requests start to come in. If you are projecting ahead to next year, um, I would say really anytime. Honestly, there's no reason to wait. Um, if I get a request like in February for a letter that I'm going to write in November, the only thing I say to people is, please just check back in with me when the autumn semester starts. I tell them I'm happy to write it for them, but just remind me so that we can reconnect. And because there's no sense in us meeting in February to talk about a letter I'm going to write 9 months later. Whatever we talk about in that meeting, I'm not going to remember well enough to have it be meaningful. So I'm going to want to reconnect with somebody in September, August, September, October, someplace when we have, it's going to be fresher in my head when I eventually do write that letter. Um, other thing, like, I know I've talked a little bit about the timing already. Um, if you have particular needs to have a letter come in earlier, be sure to ask for that. But most of the time, the only reasons you would be is if there are like scholarship or fellowship opportunities that have an earlier deadline, but that is pretty rare. But oftentimes what will happen is I think SIDCAS asks you to plug into the system like a due date for the letter. And oftentimes I think people just kind of get psyched out and they'll put in like November 1st or, middle October or something like that, just so they have a cushion. Um, you don't need to do that. That's the short answer is, just put in the due date of whenever the schools are going to start reviewing your applications, which is typically December 15th. So I always tell students I'm going to write the letter the week of Thanksgiving. That's just usually I carve out that Monday and Tuesday to kind of bang out the letters. If I have occasion to do it earlier, I will. But so if if you don't see, I guess the point I would make on this overall, as I'm kind of talking myself into circles here, is it's worth, if you're going to be somebody who's nervous about it, and I'm a generally nervous person, so I can sympathize if you are. If you're worried about if you're going to be checking back in and seeing if the letters have been uploaded, as the recommendation come in yet, if that's who you are, just ask the letter writer when they think they'll probably have the letter written. Just give me, can you give me a ballpark, or when do you typically write your letters, something like that. And so that way, I'm telling students it's the week of Thanksgiving. It typically won't be any later than that. So, if you're going to be checking back, don't bother checking back in until the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, because it probably won't be done by then. So, if you are going to be nervous about it, just get a sense from the faculty member when they might write it. It doesn't mean that you're asking, you're telling them it needs to be early, or you're pestering them about it. But if that way, if they give you a deadline and they say it's the week of Thanksgiving, and then you check in the Monday after Thanksgiving and it hasn't been done, that's a very justifiable time for you to email that person and just say, hey, I just wanted to check in and see if there's any problems with the letter, anything I can do to help you writing it. So that sort of gentle nudge that you would do. Um, but you don't want to be nudging people if before they've told you they were going to do it anyway. I don't need I don't need a reminder email or anything on November 15th if I told you I was going to write it the week of Thanksgiving. So, getting that information, that's a very reasonable question, I think, for you to ask, just so you have a sense of what the timeline is going to look like. And if you are somebody who frequently wants to check in and make sure the application is moving forward, um, that you can do that, and you'll know exactly when you should check in. So, summary, ask for letters anytime. The only thing you don't want to do is wait too long. The only thing that's going to, I think, cause you potential problems is if you don't start asking until the end of October or something like that, because people will have filled out their commitments and they will be saying, hey, I'm maxed out. I can't do this. Or it just sort of conveys a sense that you are getting to this pretty late in the process, which is not a message that you necessarily want to send to a letter writer. Getting out in front of it earlier, sooner rather than later. Again, even if someone in February says, look, I don't really, I'm not going to think about this again until September, check back in with me then. At least then you'll know when to email them again. And so I don't think anyone's going to be resentful if you're asking earlier rather than later, but it can be problematic if you are asking later rather than earlier. Other questions for me as you navigate the letters of recommendation process? Where I'll conclude then, I don't want to dip too far into your evenings here. You can always reach out to me separately if you have a question, if you have a concern. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. It's Bielefeld.6. Hit me up anytime. I will be happy to answer any questions that you have, whether it's about letters of recommendation or about the application process in general. My goal is to get you as comfortable as you can be with a pretty stressful process. Um, but the other part is, I will speak on behalf of my faculty again when I say that we want you to be successful in this process. If you are hovering over the send button of that request email and you're nervous that you're going to get a no as a response, if you get a no, it will almost certainly be because the person is just being asked to do a lot of letters. And if that happens, we will find somebody who is available and eager to write for you. Um, we are, again, invested in your success. And so anything that we can do to help you get there, I'm sure that we as a collective group will want to do. So good luck with your process. Good luck with your applications. And if you have questions, when you have questions, if there's anything that I can do to aid you in the process, please reach out to me anytime. If anyone wants to stay, I'll stop recording. If anyone wants to stay on, if you have any individual questions for me, please stay on and we can chat separately.